Utah Territory, early spring of 1884. The mountains still wore their white shawl of snow, silent as a sleeping giant. The wind from the Wasatch Range swept down the valley, sharp as a knife's edge, cutting through pine groves and across stretches of red dust and scattered rock. At the far end of the dirt road that led to a small ranch, Malcolm Hayes was splitting firewood by the barn. The axe fell in steady rhythm, each dry crack echoing through the emptiness, like the heartbeat of a man long accustomed to solitude. His shirt sleeves were faded thin, his arms corded with sinew. With the final stroke, the log split clean, halves tumbling onto the pile. He exhaled short, a plume of white breath curling in air that hadn't yet let go of winter. For him, every day was the same, task upon task, silence his only companion for 15 long years. But today, something moved at the far edge of the muddy road, breaking that rhythm. Malcolm raised his head, narrowed his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. In the distance, a figure staggered forward, legs dragging through thaw-soaked ruts. A woman. Her dark brown dress was stained with dirt, its hem heavy with clinging mud. One shoe heel seemed broken, throwing her step off balance. In her hand swung a battered leather valise, scuffed and scarred, thumping with each uncertain stride. A gust caught her hat, nearly tearing it free. She caught it with a trembling gloved hand, the leather worn thin. Her skin was bronzed from sun, her eyes bright and unyielding, though exhaustion shadowed every line of her face. She carried the look of someone driven near breaking, yet unwilling to yield. Malcolm froze, axe still at his side. The stranger drew nearer, until she reached the wooden fence where he tied his horse. When she stopped, only a few paces stood between them. The wind tore past, tugging at her thin coat, no barrier against mountain chill. Their eyes met. A brief, heavy silence. Her voice came rough, rasped by dust and cold air. Are you Mr. Hayes? Mr. Malcolm Hayes?" Malcolm didn't answer at once, only dipped his chin. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken his name outside memory. The woman breathed deep, then spoke again, clear despite the strain. "I am Selah Carter. I believe I am your mail-order bride." The last words drifted into the open air like smoke, hanging, not yet swallowed by the wind. Malcolm blinked, frowning hard. "What did you say?" Selah slipped a hand into her coat, pulled out a letter worn thin, edges frayed from too much handling. She held it out, neither pleading nor desperate, only steady, with the quiet air of resignation. "Here. Matrimonial matches, Omaha office. Your name, this ranch's address, your signature, all of it here." He took it. Black ink spelled his name bold across the page. Malcolm Hayes. Too close a likeness to be trickery, but not his hand. He knew it instantly. His grip tightened, eyes darkening. "Not mine." Selah gave a faint nod, as if she had expected as much. "I suspected. Still, it was real enough to make me leave everything. My work, the rented room, the few friends I had. I put every saved dollar into that train ticket here. And now there's no one waiting for me back east, and no one waiting for me here." Her voice faltered, thinned by the wind. Her shoulders sagged, her hand tightening on the valise. No tears, no bitterness. Only the weary weight of someone too used to doors shutting in her face. She turned, began to walk away. Slow, steady, already braced for rejection. Malcolm stood rooted, chest heavy as stone. For 15 years he had walled himself off, made silence a fortress no loss could breach. Yet that frail figure, trudging through mud, made the air catch in his lungs. A sigh tore from him, deep, unwilling. Wait. Sela paused, half-turned, eyes wary. Malcolm jerked his head toward the cabin. Rain will come before night. You can stay inside. I'll bring a chair. You can sleep by the stove. Just tonight. She hesitated, jaw tight, then dipped her head once. He swung the gate wide, stepped aside. She crossed, careful to keep distance, not brushing his sleeve. Her muddy shoes struck the gravel, his boots heavy beside hers. Two figures, two breaths, side by side toward a weathered cabin that had known only one man's footsteps in and out for years. The door groaned on its hinges. Inside, the small room glowed faintly with firelight. Malcolm set a chair near the stove, retreated to the shadows. Sela set her valise down, sat straight-backed, hands folded neat in her lap, gaze fixed on the fire, not daring to glance around. And Malcolm realized, tonight's silence would not be like any other. Outside, the wind clawed through cracks, black clouds thickening over the peaks. A spring storm pressed close. Inside the cabin, two strangers would share a roof for the first time, beginning something neither of them had imagined. The old cabin of Malcolm Hayes had long been used to one man's breath alone. Tonight, with Sela Carter sitting stiff-backed by the stove, hands clenched around the handle of her battered valise, the air shifted. Not warmer, not yet, but charged with the wary tension of two wild creatures crossing paths, uncertain whether to retreat or advance. Malcolm lowered himself into a wooden chair by the table. He peeled off his worn leather gloves, set the axe aside. Firelight flared and fell across his face, rough-hewn, weathered, scored by years of solitude. Across the room, Sela's face flickered in the same glow, her dark eyes shining with something balanced between exhaustion and quiet resolve. The small room carried only the sound of crackling logs. Sela bit her lip, slipped off her frayed gloves. Her hands showed calluses and raw scrapes, hands that did not match any picture of a bride men might conjure. She held them near the flames, letting the heat seep in. Malcolm glanced once, then quickly away, but she noticed. He rose, went to the kitchen shelf, ladled what remained of a pork and bean stew from the iron pot. The scent filled the cabin. He set a cracked plate on the table, hesitated, then carried it to her. Sela reached out slowly. Her fingers brushed his. Just a fleeting touch, enough to startle them both. She drew back, dipped her head in thanks. Malcolm only cleared his throat, turned aside. The silence that followed was no longer cold. It was clumsy, unsteady, like two people trying to remember how to share a meal. Sela ate in small, measured bites. Malcolm sat at the table, turned half away, keeping his distance yet catching every scrape of spoon against bowl. At times their eyes met across the firelight. Brief, then gone again. Night deepened. The wind battered the cabin walls, howling through the cracks like some hungry beast. Inside, the two strangers sat with their loneliness, but at least tonight neither bore it alone. Morning came, cloaked in fog. Pale light slipped through the doorframe, carrying the smell of smoke-soaked wood. Sela stirred early, pulling on her thin coat, and stepped outside. Without being told, she walked to the yard, where hens scratched in the dirt. Her shoes, stiff with dried mud, sank into the thawed ground. She scattered a handful of grain from the sack by the fence. The chickens rushed, wings rustling. Malcolm came out behind her, standing on the porch, arms folded. He'd done this chore himself for years. Yet seeing her crouched low, dress hem dirtied, hands sure as she tossed feed, it unsettled him. Like some missing piece had slipped quietly into his guarded life. She turned, eyes meeting his. They held for a beat. Selah gave a small nod, then went back to her work. Back inside, she set water to boil in the dented copper kettle. The whistle rose high, then fell. She sliced the last of the hard bread, warmed it on the stove, set it neatly on the table. When Malcolm stepped in, she looked up briefly, wordless invitation in her eyes. He sat. No thanks spoken, no welcome offered. Yet when his hand reached for the cup, it brushed against hers. Another careless touch, small but sharp. Selah felt her pulse quicken. Malcolm, too, lingered an instant, before jerking his gaze away. Breakfast ended. Malcolm pulled on his coat, readying for the barn. But as he opened the door, he stopped short. The porch had been swept clean, the crust of leaves and mud gone. Inside, the torn curtain had been mended, the squeaky hinge oiled, the fireplace stones wiped free of soot. Selah knelt in the corner, broom in hand, sweat dampening her brow. She looked up, eyes bright, then bent back to her work. Malcolm stood still, a man staring at cracks in a wall he'd built 15 years, now patched by someone else's hand. He went on with his day, checking the fence line, trimming branches, tending his horse. But the image of her remained, bent to labor, light gathering in the cabin around her. He could not set it aside. Evening fell. Selah stoked the fire, the scent of stew filling the air again. Malcolm returned, boots caked in mud, shirt streaked with sawdust. He stepped inside. Her gaze rose to meet his. Selah quietly filled a bowl, set it before him. Their fingers touched once more, but this time he did not pull away. He only dipped his head, eyes steady on hers. Selah smiled faintly, though whether at him or herself he could not tell. The cabin, long only a shelter, now carried other sounds, spoon against bowl, wood crackling, and beneath it all, the slow easing of two hearts learning to live with warmth again. In the days that followed, the old log cabin began to carry sounds Malcolm Hayes had long forgotten belonged to a home. The faint click of a needle through cloth, the sweep of a broom along warped boards, the quiet stir of a spoon in a chipped porcelain cup. Yet those small changes did not mean the distance between them had vanished. Selah Carter moved as though she had always belonged, though he had never spoken a word, asking her to stay beyond a single night. She patched the torn curtain with steady stitches, firm and even. She scrubbed the damp-stained floorboards until the thin light coming through the cracks glinted off wood far cleaner than before. Meals shifted too. Malcolm had lived on salted pork and hard bread chewed without taste. Now, he found the scent of stew filling the air or before he even crossed the threshold. Beans simmered soft, laced with slivers of pork, sometimes brightened with herbs Selah had gathered by the creek. The fragrance lightened the gloom of the place, though neither spoke of it. They rarely traded words. When Selah swept, Malcolm walked the fence line. When she kindled fire, he sharpened the axe on the porch. They avoided each other's gaze, as if one look too long could undo the walls he had bricked high over 15 years. Yet Malcolm began noticing things he had once ignored. One morning, rain came sudden and hard. Sela returned from the well, her thin cloak soaked, curls plastered to her face. She shook as she wrung water from her sleeves. By afternoon, a heavy coat hung on the hook near the door. It was his, though he never mentioned it. She paused, glanced at him. He feigned attention to his woodpile, but she slipped it on. No thanks given, no explanation offered, but the silence spoke louder than words. Another night, with the wind clawing through the walls, Sela coughed deep and often. Malcolm sat at the table pretending to study a ledger, yet every rasp reached him. At last he rose, fed the fire, set water to boil. From the back of the cupboard he dug out a forgotten tin of peppermint leaves, dry and faded with age. He brewed the tea, left the cup by her bed. At dawn, she found it empty, the warmth still clinging. She did not ask. He did not tell. The cabin slowly shed its shape as a loner's shelter. It began to breathe with the presence of two, though both clung tight to their distance. Sela held to courtesy. When she set a bowl of stew for Malcolm, she placed it before him, hands gone before his could reach. Yet sometimes, fingers brushed over a pot handle or on the narrow doorframe when both passed at once. Each time they drew back sharply, as if the smallest touch were more dangerous than any wound. Malcolm lived as though half-exiled within his own walls. He let her sweep, mend, and order, while he kept to the shadows of avoidance. But in quiet moments, when she was bent over her stitching, his eyes lingered on her slight frame curled over the cloth, her roughened but careful hands, the tangle of curls glowing by firelight. Sela noticed. She knew this silence well, the silence of men scarred deep. Yet Malcolm's quiet was not just retreat. It was fear. Fear of nearing someone. Fear of losing again. She asked nothing of it, only continued with her small tasks, planting seeds of change in barren ground. Time moved on, ruled by unspoken pauses. They had never yet shared a meal at the same table. Malcolm always waited until she had finished, left only a rinsed bowl. Sela neither protested nor grieved. She understood it as the line he held. Yet in those long silences, cracks began to show. One afternoon, she went to the creek to wash. When Malcolm returned from the pasture, fresh cloth hung on the line, old curtains washed and mended, swaying white in the wind. He stopped, staring. For the first time in years, the cabin seemed less a shelter, more a home. Night came. Sela placed a lamp on the table, the flame throwing her shadow tall against the wall. Malcolm sat a few paces away, knife against whetstone, though his eyes betrayed him. The light caught hers, shining steady, carrying a resolve that would not bend. For a breath, their eyes locked. His dropped, but his chest tightened all the same. Neither broke the silence. Yet in that hush, something unspoken was taking shape. Sela demanded nothing. Malcolm promised nothing. They simply lived in the same space, holding a distance just far enough not to wound, yet close enough to begin noticing, perhaps even needing, the other's presence. That evening, thick clouds gathered over the western peaks. The valley carried that strange stillness that comes before a storm, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Malcolm Hayes stood under the porch, brushing down his old horse. The coarse rasp of bristles against hide and the animal's steady snort were the only sounds to cut the hush. Behind him, Sela Carter sat on the steps, boots caked with earth, skirts hitched clear of the mud. hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea. She had been silent since noon, after she cleared the table from another meal he had eaten alone. Between them stretched not just space, but a wall of habit and fear. The wind hissed through the boards. Sila lifted her eyes to his back. The weight of a question lodged like a stone in her chest. At last she set the cup aside, rose and crossed a few steps closer. Her voice came low, but steady. "If you do not want me here, why have you not sent me away?" The brush froze in Malcolm's hand. His shoulders went rigid. The horse shifted, snorted, but he remained still, as if the words had struck the very place he had long kept shuttered. Slowly, he turned his head. The gray eyes that usually slid off her now held steady. The last flare of sunset lit them, revealing fatigue, caution, and something buried deeper that she could not yet read. The sight clenched her chest, not because it was tender, but because it was true. For the first time since her arrival, she felt he actually saw her, not as a stranger, not as a burden, but as herself. The silence stretched, wind whipping the fence line. Sila did not lower her gaze. She stood firm, meeting him. Malcolm set the brush aside, fingers trembling faintly. He drew in breath, dipped his head once as though granting her question its due. "I do not know." His voice was hoarse from disuse, but so bare in its honesty it startled her. Sila stepped half a pace nearer. Only an arm's reach divided them. The wind caught strands of her curls, tossing them across her face. Her dark eyes glinted with resolve edged by fragility. "You had the chance. Many times." Her tone held no bitterness, only quiet weight. "Why not?" Malcolm's hand pressed against the horse's flank, as though needing anchor. Yet his gaze slid back to her, tethered by an unseen line. A long pause. Sila waited, not pressing, but her stillness demanded an answer all the same. At last, he exhaled. "I lost someone. Long ago. Thought I would lose everything if I let another in, but when you turned to leave that day, I could not bear it." The words were halting, clumsy. Still, they cut through the thick silence like an axe through timber. Sila's heart tightened. She had guessed at shadows in his past, and though he had only cracked the door, even that carried the weight of years spent in solitude. Their eyes met once more, not the stolen glances at mealtime, nor the quick flickers when hands brushed. This time he let the look linger, measured in breaths. She held it, unflinching, letting him see both the weariness of one abandoned too often and the strength of one still standing. The clouds dragged heavy across the sky, smearing the horizon in gray. Yet between them, the silence shifted. No longer a barrier, it opened like a narrow path, not wide enough to step through, but wide enough to believe one might. Malcolm turned back to his horse, brushing again, though slower now. Sila retreated to the steps, gathering the cooled cup between her palms. Her eyes stayed on his back, a quiet stir of hope rising in her chest, unnamed but insistent. When the sun sank fully, the sky burned dark red like banked coals. Malcolm tied off the horse and walked inside. At the doorway, Sila rose. They passed each other in the narrow frame, shoulders grazing, breath mingling for a heartbeat. The brush of contact stopped them both. Malcolm glanced at her, eyes caught again. Sila did not lower hers. In that brief space, the cabin felt smaller, holding only them and the fragile emptiness slowly filling between. He inclined his head, stepping back to let her through first. She moved past, though her gaze lingered a moment longer, leaving its trace behind. That night, with firelight spilling over the room, they sat in their familiar corners. No words spoken. Yet the silence was altered. Heavy still, but not cold. Heavy with waiting. Sela bent to mend the tear in an old sleeve, needle flashing in lamplight. Malcolm honed his knife, but his eyes lifted more often, lingering a beat too long on her face. Sela felt it, and against her will, her heart stirred. Rain pattered against the roof. Inside, two people, once strangers bound by nothing, discovered silence could take many shapes. And tonight, it was no longer the silence of distance. It was the silence of a wall beginning, at last, to crack. That day began as any other. The ground was still slick from last night's rain, the air sharp with spring chill that slipped through thin cloth. At first light, Sela Carter was already in the yard. She rolled her sleeves, crossed the fence line, and bent to scatter grain for the hens. Then she turned to the goat shed, pulling out old straw, hauling buckets of water from the well, laboring without pause. From the porch, Malcolm Hayes watched. He leaned against the post, eyes following every movement. Not a word passed his lips, but he knew she was working past her strength. For weeks now, Sela had scarcely let her hands rest, mending, sweeping, cooking, and now taking on chores outdoors. Alone, she bore what he had carried in silence for years. By afternoon, the skies broke open again. Sela returned from the creek with a bundle of wet laundry. Her dress clung, shoulders trembling with chill. She set the basket down, braced herself against the table, breathing hard. Malcolm frowned, about to speak, but she forced a thin smile. "I'm fine. Just a little tired." Then she slipped into the small room and closed the door. Night fell with rain drumming the roof, wind moaning through the walls. Malcolm sat at the table, ledger open, though his eyes never traced a line. Unease gnawed at him. At last he rose and crossed to her door. He rapped 3 times, steady. "Sela?" No answer. He pushed it ajar. Firelight spilled in from the stove outside, falling across her curled figure on the bed. Her hair was damp, her face drained of color, lips cracked. A basin stood untouched at her side. He crossed the room swiftly. His palm brushed her brow. Heat seared his skin. He pulled back at once, startled, like a man touching forbidden ground. For 15 years, he had not laid a hand on another soul, but he could not turn away now. He stoked the fire high, set water to boil, then returned to her side. Her lashes fluttered, breath quick and shallow, words slipping from her lips, broken and incoherent, caught somewhere between waking and fevered dream. Malcolm soaked a cloth, wrung it out, laid it across her forehead. Each time it cooled, he replaced it. He sat hunched, calloused hands clumsy in their care, yet unwilling to let go. Memories surged. Another room. Another lifetime. A letter of loss. A young wife who had gone to serve as a nurse in the war, never to return. He remembered her last morning, her promise to come back, and his failure to stop her. Since then, he had believed every touch invited ruin, that survival meant refusing closeness. But now, when his hand brushed Sela's clenched beneath the quilt, he did not withdraw. He closed his fingers over hers, as though that fragile grip alone could tether her to life. "You're safe, Seela," he said, voice rough, unpracticed, yet firm. "No harm will come. You're not alone." She stirred faintly, lips trembling, as if she heard. A broken sigh left her, and her body eased. Malcolm held, still, thumb stroking across her knuckles. It had been years since he let another's warmth seep into his own palm. The night stretched long. Rain beat heavy, then light, then heavy again. Wind circled the cabin. Malcolm did not sleep. Hour by hour, he refreshed the cloth, replenished the fire, fed her sips of warm water. Most of all, he never released her hand. At times she whispered, panic threading her fever. "Don't. Please don't." He bent low, whispering back as vow, "I'm here. No one will touch you. You're safe." And for the first time in 15 years, Malcolm realized silence no longer sufficed. Tonight, words were needed, words to anchor another soul to this world. Toward dawn, the fever broke. Her breath slowed. Her body slackened into rest. Malcolm slumped in his chair, head bent, her hand still held tight. Pale light seeped through the cracks before he noticed his own face damp. He had shed tears, unbidden, somewhere between memory and fear of losing again. Seela stirred, eyes flickering open. She looked at him, surprised. He startled, began to pull away, but too late. She had seen. Her voice rasped, weak but clear. "You stayed the night." He did not answer at once, only dipped his head, withdrawing his hand slowly, as if guilty of some forbidden act. "High fever. Best not to be left alone," he muttered, voice stiff, though his eyes betrayed the worry he could not hide. A thin smile tugged at her lips, trembling. "I thought I might die." Malcolm gripped the chair hard, gaze fixed on the floor. He found no words, only the strange release in his chest that came from knowing she still lived. Seela let her eyes drift shut again. Her whisper barely rose above the rain. "Thank you." The cabin felt changed, not silence of strangers, not tension bricked like walls. That night, amid fragile breaths and watchful care, a thread had been woven between them, and Malcolm knew the moment he clasped her hand, he had crossed the boundary he once swore never to cross. Whatever tomorrow held, he no longer carried the curse of being untouchable. He felt once more like a man among the living. The fever left her slowly, like ice surrendering after a long winter. One morning, Seela Carter sat upright, pale but steady, breath no longer ragged. She wrapped a thin shawl about her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. The air carried damp wood and smoke. Malcolm Hayes sat nearby, sharpening his axe, though his eyes kept straying toward her, making certain she did not falter. Seela lowered herself onto the step, gazing across the wide fields still scarred with puddles from the storm. Silence lay between them, but it was not the silence of distance anymore. It was pause, space enough for two hearts to breathe together. "I owe you," she said softly, eyes still on the valley. "That night, without you, I might not have lived." Malcolm stilled his blade. He meant to say it was nothing, just what anyone might have done. But the truth was heavier. He had sat with her all night, held her hand, whispered promises into fevered dreams, and every moment had shattered the vow of silence he'd guarded for 15 years. "You owe me nothing," he answered, voice rough. "I only could not watch another leave before my eyes." Sela turned, her dark eyes fixing on his lean face. In that look, she caught sight of the hidden scar he carried too long. "You lost someone." Malcolm's nod was heavy. He set the axe aside, fingers knotting together. "She was my wife, a volunteer nurse. She went to tend the wounded and never came back. A shell took her life. I received the notice as though it were my own sentence. From then on, I never touched another. I believed if I kept my heart closed, I would lose nothing more." The words tumbled out, jagged as stones rolling down a slope. Sela did not interrupt. She only slid a half-step nearer, letting her sleeve brush his arm. The slight contact made him tremble, yet he did not pull away. For the first time in years, he let someone close enough to feel. Sela drew in breath, her voice low but steady. "I lost all as well, though in another way. After my parents died, I was sold into a boarding house. They called it an apprenticeship, but it was labor. I cooked, scrubbed floors until my hands bled. And when the master drank, I hid, praying not to be dragged into shadows. I escaped in a freight car with nothing but a broken valise. I did not come here to find a husband. I came for a chance, to live as a person." Her hand gripped her skirt tight. Malcolm met her eyes, saw strength and fragility twined together. They differed in skin, in path, yet loss had carved them into the same shape. "You are strong," he murmured. Sela shook her head, a thin smile breaking. "No. I've only grown used to being left behind. So when I came here, I thought you would do the same. But you didn't. You stayed." The words struck him still. For years, he had thought only of his own pain. Yet in her eyes, his simple act of not turning her away was already a small miracle. By dusk, the cabin glowed with firelight. They sat at the table, stew steaming between them. Sela ladled his portion, her hand brushing his as she passed the bowl. This time, neither drew back. Their eyes held, long, unbroken. Without a word, Malcolm rose, circled the table, and sat beside her. Sela lifted her gaze, black eyes trembling in the flicker, yet unflinching. His hand rose, touching lightly a curl fallen against her cheek. She shivered, but tilted her face into his palm. The distance between them dissolved. Breath mingled. Shoulder pressed shoulder. Then lips touched. Hesitant, trembling, as if two souls were learning how to begin again. Sela's arms slipped around his shoulders, fingers clutching the worn fabric of his shirt. Malcolm drew her close, chest tight with fear that if he released her, she might vanish. That night, the cabin carried new sounds, not only wind and crackling logs, but quickened breath, whispered fragments, warmth rising between two bodies who had endured too many winters alone. When they lay side by side, firelight painting the walls, Malcolm bent close, his voice rough in her ear. "I thought I had died with the past, but you have made me live again." Sela rested her head against his chest, eyes closing, lips shaping a fragile reply. "And I, for the first time, am not left behind." Outside, spring winds swept the ridges, carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of a new season. Inside, two souls, once stripped of all, had finally found each other. not in vows or fair words, but in the true touch of those who had borne enough loneliness. That night of intimacy was not only flesh, it was the joining of two broken spirits, fitting pieces back together, learning they no longer had to walk this life alone. 2 weeks after the fever, Selah Carter's strength returned, her face no longer pale, her dark eyes alive again. One morning, while chopping vegetables for supper, she hesitated, then lifted her gaze to Malcolm Hayes. "I need new thread and cloth. That curtain can't take another patch." Malcolm set down his hammer, wiped sweat from his brow. He nodded, then began saddling the horse. It had been years since anyone inside his cabin had spoken such a simple request, and he found himself not resenting it. "Let's go," he said. Selah blinked. "You mean I go with you?" He nodded. Just that, but it sent a tremor of anticipation through her. The road to Millwater twisted down the valley, wagon wheels grinding in mud and stone after rain. Selah sat beside him, hands gripping her skirt, curls tossed by the mountain wind. Malcolm glanced her way, saw her lips pressed tight, knowing her nerves. He said nothing, only kept the reins firm, steadying the buckboard. Millwater came into view, a scatter of wooden buildings, a smithy, saloon, general store, and a weathered church steeple. Horses whinnied, wheels rattled, a banjo spilled out of the saloon. All things Malcolm had ignored before seemed different now, for beside him sat a woman wary of the world's eyes. When they halted before the general store, the stares began. Selah stepped down, skirts catching mud, fingers tightening on her basket handle. Merchant wives whispered, tittering behind gloves. A man leaning against the porch post spat tobacco, smirked. "Mail-order hussy," he muttered, loud enough for all. Selah heard. She stiffened, face hardening, but did not bow her head. Malcolm stood at her side, gaze sweeping the crowd. The laughter ebbed to uneasy silence, though the murmurs carried still. Inside, the air grew heavier. The storekeeper, a middle-aged woman, looked Selah over head to toe, lips drawn thin. The glance cut like a blade, stripping dignity without a word. Selah almost turned back, but Malcolm's hand landed firm on her shoulder, stopping her. For the first time, she felt his touch before others. Needles, thread, cloth. His voice carried low and steady, filling the store. The woman flinched, then turned to fetch the order. Still the whispers lingered. Where had she come from? Who sent her? Was she here to take Cain's land? Selah swallowed, hands trembling faintly. But Malcolm pivoted to face the porch, eyes sharp as steel. "Listen close," he said. His tone was not loud, yet it cut through every murmur. "She is no hussy. She is not a thing bought. She is not a burden." His gaze swept across each face. "She is worth more than the lot of you." The air froze. A horse whinnied far off, the sound hanging sharp against the hush. Some lowered their eyes, others gave nervous, broken chuckles. None dared answer. Selah stood still, chest tightening. His words echoed inside her. Impossible to believe they had come from a man who had lived in silence for months. The storekeeper returned, hands trembling as she set the goods on the counter, no longer meeting Selah's eyes. Malcolm gathered them, paid, then tipped his head toward Selah. They stepped out together. The crowd scattered like spooked birds. Selah, stunned, followed him back to the wagon. As Malcolm took the reins, her hand slowly slid atop his. a light touch, but firm. He turned slightly, meeting her gaze. Her eyes shone, full of unspoken feeling. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. No more words were needed, for Millwater had heard enough, and Sela had heard more than she ever hoped to. On the way home, spring wind rattled the pines. Wagon wheels jolted over rock, but inside the seat between them, a gentle quiet spread. Sela leaned back, eyes closed, lips curving faintly. For the first time, she felt the world could no longer cast her alone. Malcolm kept his gaze forward, reins steady. Yet inside him, a fire stirred. His words in Millwater had not only defended her against the town, they had revealed the truth to himself. The woman beside him had crossed his silence and become part of him. One late spring afternoon, with wind moving through the pines and sunlight spilling gold across the fields, Sela Carter climbed the rickety ladder to the attic. Malcolm Hayes had mentioned there might be old nails and hinges stored up there, and she meant to find them to fix the barn door that shrieked with every gust. The attic smelled of damp wood and moth-eaten cloth. Dust hung in the air, light slicing through roof cracks like pale threads. Sela pushed aside a stack of old trunks, her hand brushing against a wooden box buried beneath a quilt. She meant to pass it by. Yet something tugged at her, urging her to drag it out. Dust rose thick as she coughed. She lifted the lid. Inside was no hardware, but a frame wrapped in faded linen. She unwrapped it slowly. Within the black and white image, a younger Malcolm stood beside a woman with a face both strong and tender. Her hand rested on his chest. His arm looped around her waist. He was smiling, wide, unguarded, a smile so rare Sela's heart clenched to see it. She sat long, the picture trembling in her hands. No one had to tell her who the woman was. This was the ghost living in the silence of the cabin, in the hesitance of his every gesture, in his fear of touch. By the time Malcolm returned from the pasture, the sun was sinking. He found Sela on the porch step, the photograph on her lap, her face burnished bronze by the dying light, eyes bright but shadowed with sorrow. He stopped dead, his grip tightened on the saddle. "I was searching for nails," Sela said softly. "Instead, I found her." Malcolm swallowed, throat tight. He set the saddle down and stepped closer. Sela lifted the photograph once more, studied it, then offered it back. "She was beautiful. And you smiled differently then." His hand shook as he took it. The dam he had braced for 15 years strained at the edges. He turned aside, breath ragged. Sela's gaze stayed steady, her voice quiet but firm. "I am not her. I will never be her." Malcolm's eyes squeezed shut. His lip caught between his teeth until blood touched his tongue. Sela moved nearer, laid her hand gently on his arm. "But I can love you, in my own way." The words were simple, yet heavy as stone. They cracked the deepest wall inside him. His shoulders shuddered. Tears welled, trailing down the hard lines of his face, falling onto the picture frame. His voice broke. "I thought I was cursed, that anyone I loved would be taken. I believed silence would spare me from losing more." Sela said nothing. She let her hand rest on his arm, presence enough. "I held it all inside," Malcolm whispered, head bowed. "But the night you burned with fever, when I held your hand, I was afraid. Afraid you too would vanish. And now, when I look at you, I no longer want to hide. Tears spilled freely, but they were not the heavy kind. They came like water after drought, carrying life back into parched ground. Sela smiled faintly. She drew him close, letting his head rest on her shoulder, her hand stroking through strands of hair touched with gray. You are not cursed, Malcolm. You are alive, and living means there will be pain, but also hope. He trembled in her arms, the last of his tears wetting her dress. For the first time in 15 years, Malcolm wept not in secret, but before someone who stayed to witness his weakness. They sat that way until the fields turned dark and the first stars kindled above. When he rose, Malcolm placed the photograph on the small mantel in the corner. He did not hide it again. He let it stand, a piece of his life past. But when he turned back, his eyes did not linger on the frame. They settled on Sela, the dark-skinned woman with the steady light in her eyes, the one who had said she could love him her way. He stepped forward, took her hand. This time it did not tremble. Sela closed her fingers around his, firm. No words were needed. Both knew a new chapter had begun. The fire burned steady in the hearth, light casting tall shadows on the cabin walls. Two silhouettes stood side by side now, no longer apart. Dusk had fallen by the time Malcolm Hayes tied his horse before the lone saloon in Millwater. He seldom entered such places. There was nothing inside but drunken laughter and the sting of cheap whiskey. But tonight, a shipment of nails and rope had come in, stored in the saloon's back room. To collect it, he had to pass through the noise. Sela Carter walked beside him, basket tucked in her arm, freshly filled with salt and herbs from the general store. She no longer bowed her head the way she once had, yet her presence at his side drew whispers like dry grass catching flame. And today, whispers became jeers. The moment they pushed through the batwing doors, the piano stuttered to a halt, half a beat hanging in the air. Several men at the nearest table turned, eyes glassy with liquor. Among them sat McDubbins, broad, red-faced, whiskers dripping beer, a man long wed to drink. He squinted, laughed through his teeth. Well, Cold Cane finally brings his new stock out for show? The table roared. Another man slapped the boards. Perfect match! A block of wood and a mail-order hussy. Sela froze, knuckles white around her basket, but she did not bow. Malcolm stood still beside her, stiff as oak, gray eyes darkening. McDubbins staggered up, weaving, planting himself in their path. His gaze slid over Sela, slow and crude. Tell us, did you arrive by parcel? Where does Kane order this kind of stock? Or did you sell yourself just to eat? Laughter rippled. The air grew taut, all waiting. For years, Kane had been the man who said nothing, who kept to himself. Malcolm stepped forward, tall frame casting its shadow over the drunk. His voice carried, low but clear. One more word, McDubbins. The man sneered, rolling his shoulders. What word? I only speak truth. She's no wife, just something you dragged home. Fire to warm a cold night, nothing more. It happened faster than a breath. Malcolm's fist drove clean into McDubbin's jaw. The man crashed to the floorboards, chair splintering, tankard scattering ale across the room. Silence fell hard. Only the groan of McDubbin's rolling in pain broke it. Malcolm straightened, hand still clenched, gaze sweeping the room. He did not roar. He did not bluster. His voice came steady as iron. She is not for your talk. His eyes burned, fixed on them all. She is mine. The saloon held its breath. Faces shifted, some ashamed, some uneasy, one or two nodding faintly in shadowed corners. Sela stood unmoving, heart thundering. The words pounded in her ears. She is mine. Not in anger, not in denial, but claimed, plain and open. Malcolm stooped, lifted the basket from her hands, then laced his fingers firmly with hers. For the first time, it was not a hesitant brush, not an accident. He bound her hand in his, leading her out past the staring crowd, leaving whispers unfinished. The road home was quiet. Sila sat on the wagon bench, his hand still holding hers. He did not release it, nor did he speak. Yet the silence was heavy with promise. She glanced at his profile, chiseled in fading light, and saw not only anger, but choice. You said it before them all, she murmured. Malcolm turned, gave a single nod. Because it's true. Her lips curved, trembling but warm. She tightened her grip, sealing what had been spoken in the open. For the first time, she knew she was no longer a guest in his home, no longer a passing shadow. Word spread through Millwater faster than any horse could run. That evening, talk rang in the saloon, the market, even the small church porch. Cain had floored McDubbins and declared the dark-skinned woman his own. By morning, eyes upon Sela had shifted, still measuring, still cautious, but less cruel. An old woman gave a nod. A child waved and giggled. The sting of mockery had dulled. Malcolm seemed unchanged. He worked the fences, tended stock, moved through his days as before. But each time he returned to the cabin and found Sela at the hearth, the memory burned in him. The moment when his hand closed around hers, when laughter turned to silence. That night, Sela sat by the window, moonlight silvering her face. Malcolm came close, laying his hand upon her shoulder. She lifted her gaze, meeting his steady, softened eyes. "No one will call you that again," he said. Sela's smile came quiet, her hand rising to cover his. "They need not call me anything at all, so long as you look at me as you did today." Malcolm drew her close, arms strong around her. Words were no longer needed. That embrace spoke for him and for her. Winter edged close, a veil of thin frost lying over the fields like a pale bridal cloth. Inside the small cabin, fire popped and crackled, yet the air felt heavy as stone. Malcolm Hayes stood at the table, both hands pressed against the rough boards. Sela Carter sat by the hearth, a half-finished basket of yarn in her lap. Since the day she had found the photograph, words had grown scarce between them. Not distance, but something swelling, waiting to break open. Malcolm drew a long breath, like a man about to march into battle with himself. "Sela, there's something I must tell you." She lifted her eyes, dark and steady, neither pressing nor afraid. "The letter." His voice rasped. "The one that brought you here. It wasn't from me." Sela's brow creased faintly. He stepped closer, lowering into the chair opposite, firelight casting hollow shadows across his face. "Jonah, my friend. The only man who still dared cross into this ranch. He thought, I needed someone to drag me out of ashes. He sent the letter to the Omaha marriage office. My name, my address, my signature." Malcolm paused, hands clenched tight. "I was furious when I found out. I had sworn never to open my door again. But then, you came, and since that day, my silence has not been the same. The confession hung in the air. Sela set aside her yarn, rose slowly, stepped forward. Her eyes held no anger, no surprise. I know. Malcolm blinked. You knew? She nodded, a smile faint with sorrow, yet tender. From the first day, when you recoiled at my touch, a man who truly sought a wife would not fear so much. But I did not come here to demand. I did not come to find a husband. Her voice trembled, yet firm. I came for a chance to live. Malcolm lifted his gaze, gray eyes wide. In the east, I was a shadow in a boarding house, a body others ordered around. Here, for the first time, I've seen my own hands build a home. For the first time, I've felt another's eyes on me without scorn. I stayed, not for the letter, not for Jonah. I stayed because I saw myself in this house. Malcolm's chest tightened, every word hammering against the fear he had carried too long. Slowly, he reached across, rough hand covering hers. And if I told you, I want you here, not out of duty, would you believe me? Sela looked at the hand wrapped over hers. Tears shimmered, yet she smiled. I believe you, because you no longer call me stranger. You call me by name. Malcolm bowed his head, brow pressing against her hand. For the first time in 15 years, he admitted aloud, Sela, I choose you. Not the past, not a replacement. You alone. Her tears fell, but her lips curved upward. She squeezed his hand, whispering, and I choose you. That night the cabin glowed bright with fire. They sat side by side, words spilling gently. Malcolm speaking of Jonah, of winters drowned in whiskey. Sela speaking of nights, hidden in storerooms, dreaming of a place no one could command her. When the wind howled against the door, Malcolm drew her against him. She rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Slow, steady, like the ground beneath them. No longer two drifters, two souls who had chosen each other, across barren earth yet blooming with new life. Outside, the moon crested the peaks, silver light spreading like witness to their beginning. At dawn, Sela stepped onto the porch to find Malcolm waiting, gloves in his hands. He offered them, voice quiet but firm. From this day, no matter what town says, no matter who doubts, we face it together. Sela slid the gloves on, nodded once. Together. They walked down the steps, morning mist dissolving before the rising sun. And for the first time in Malcolm Hayes's heart, there was no echo of death, only the promise of life, bound to the woman whose hand he held. Spring came, snow retreating from the mountains, bearing dark earth where fresh shoots of grass pushed through. The air carried the smell of thawing soil, of sap rising in young branches. Inside the wooden cabin, fire snapped in the hearth. There, Sela Carter laid a hand against her belly. No one told her. No certificate was needed. A woman who had lived by listening to every shift in her own body knew it well enough. Inside her, a small life had begun to grow. That afternoon, Malcolm Hayes came in from the pasture, shirt dusty, shoulders carrying the scent of sweat and wind. He found Sela seated by the window, her black eyes glimmering with a strange light. She did not speak at once. Instead, she took his hand and guided it to rest against the flat curve beneath her plain dress. Malcolm froze. Hands roughened by years of axes and rains now pressed against something soft, fragile. He swallowed hard, as though the ground beneath him had tilted. "Here," Sela whispered. "A life." His chest tightened. He tried to pull away, afraid the weight of his palm might break what was still unseen. But Sela caught his hand, lacing her fingers into his. "Don't be afraid," she said. "I have carried fear too long. Now I want to share it." Malcolm bent his forehead to hers, breath shaking. "I have lost, and lost too much. The thought of losing again, it chokes me." Sela met his gray eyes, the ones long shadowed by grief. "I have lost too. My family, my childhood, even my dignity. But when a new life arrives, it is not only fear. It is proof that we can begin again." He shut his eyes, and a tear slipped free, trailing down the lines of his weathered face. He no longer tried to hide it. He left his hand where she had placed it, letting warmth spread outward like a fire in winter night. "I don't know how to be a father," he confessed. "I only know how to lose." Sela smiled, soft but steady. "Then we will learn together. A child doesn't need a perfect father, only one who can love, even through fear." Her words sank deep, like rain into dry ground. Malcolm pressed her hand firmer against her belly. For the first time in 15 years, he did not feel himself standing at the edge of a grave. He felt himself standing at the edge of a beginning. Days turned, and the cabin shifted with them. Malcolm built a small wooden shelf by the window, where sunlight fell, a place for Sela's sewing for the child. Behind the cabin, she planted pumpkin and carrot seeds, whispering that one day their child would eat food grown from this soil. Evenings found them beside the fire. Often Malcolm would lay his hand against Sela's stomach, silent, simply listening to the hush of 3 lives instead of 2. In her eyes, Sela saw more than grief in him now. She saw the faint, trembling light of hope. Once, when she coughed lightly, he hurried with a blanket, wrapping her shoulders, rubbing her back with awkward care. His words came, rough, almost gruff. "Keep warm, not just for you, for the little one too." Sela laughed, the sound bright in the small room, and worry thinned like smoke. Still, fear lingered. One night, Malcolm woke and found her sleeping peacefully, hand resting over the gentle swell of her belly. He slipped outside, staring at the pale moon above the ridges, memory dragging him back to graves and death notices. Sela followed, shawl drawn tight, and stood beside him. "You're thinking of loss again." He nodded. He would not lie. "I fear the day it repeats. I fear standing at a grave hollow once more." She wrapped her arms around him from behind, her voice firm. "We don't know tomorrow, but we know today. And today we have each other. We have the life inside me. That is enough to keep walking." He turned, pulling her into his arms. Their shadows merged in the pale light. No stone marker was needed. No oath carved into wood. The vow lived in their hearts. Though afraid, they would step forward. Next morning, Malcolm readied his horse in the yard. As he placed a boot in the stirrup, Sela's voice called across the porch. "Malcolm!" He looked back. She stood on the steps, one hand on her belly, the other holding high a small cloth she had stitched, its edge newly hemmed. "For our child," she said, voice trembling but radiant. He stared, then strode quickly back, wrapping both her and the cloth in his arms. His voice came hoarse, steady. For our child. That day on the Utah pasture, Malcolm Hayes worked with a vigor he had never known, not merely to endure, but to prepare for the life coming. In the cabin, Selah folded the cloth, set another line of stitches, and smiled with the quiet faith of a woman who believed they had already crossed fear and chosen a future together. Inside, the fire burned warm. Outside, the prairie stretched wide, offering the canvas of a new chapter. Two people who had once lost everything now stood bound, not by fate, not by bargain, but by their own choosing. If this story stirs memories of your own, share them below. And if you've found hope in Malcolm and Selah's journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and pass it on, so more hearts can find comfort in Wild West love stories such as this one.